Redefining addiction. Normally, when we look at addiction, we tend to see it as a weakness of will, a bad habit born of moral failing, something that must be conquered by discipline and choice. But this view is not only an oversimplification, it is also a profound misunderstanding of a deeper cry from the soul. Carl Jung, with his vast exploration of the unconscious, saw addiction not as a character flaw, but as a symbol. It is a painful, misguided attempt to restore wholeness in a psyche torn from its spiritual roots. Beneath every compulsion, every dependence, every self-destructive behavior, Jung saw an internal fracture, a gap between the fragmented ego and the yearning to reconnect with something greater, something sacred. For Jung, the addict is not merely a weak-willed individual, but a soul estranged from its own center, desperately seeking connection with the numinous, with the divine spark that gives life direction and depth. All you have is a sick soul that needs a spiritual experience, Jung once wrote, a statement that echoes like a key unlocking the entire nature of addiction. What defines the addict is not the substance or the behavior itself, but the hollow pain beneath, the unspoken question, what am I truly missing? Often the addict cannot articulate what they are seeking. They feel only an uneasy restlessness, a chronic dissatisfaction that neither logic nor words can grasp. This pain is existential, and so is the longing. And in that pain, they reach outward toward alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling, food, or endless scrolling, hoping to fill what can only be healed from within. These dependencies become more than habits. They become false sacraments, temporary rituals through which the soul attempts to touch the sacred. But it is a substitute, a replacement for meaning, for connection, for inner union that even the addict doesn't realize they have lost. What the addict truly craves is not the substance, but a sense of internal coherence, a relationship with something greater, a union with a deeper meaning that transcends the boundaries of the ego. Yet the release they seek, no matter how powerful, is always temporary. It soothes the pain for a few hours, maybe a few days, before the original emptiness returns with even greater intensity. And so, the cycle continues. The spiritual hunger and the failed ritual. This cycle tightens and deepens, not because of weakness, but because of a soul that is spiritually starved. The more one clings to external objects, the further one drifts from the inner axis of suffering. Jung saw this cycle not as a character failure, but as a spiritual hunger, a sacred yearning for truth, wholeness, and reconciliation with the self. In this light, addiction becomes an unconscious cry to reconnect with the eternal. In ancient texts, the use of mind-altering substances was never arbitrary. It was always wrapped in ritual, protected by myth, and guided by elders. It was a gateway to the sacred, a descent into the symbolic universe to commune with the gods. Today, in a culture stripped of sacredness, rituals, and inner myths, the modern addict unconsciously mimics this ancient pattern, but without structure, without symbols, without soul. The very substance that once expanded consciousness now devours it, leading not to transcendence, but to collapse. Jung warned that man cannot live by logic alone. He needs symbols, living images of the sacred to orient his mind. When these inner symbols decay, when myth dies and is not replaced, the soul begins to fragment, and in that fragmentation, addiction appears, not as a moral failure, but as a failed ritual, a broken initiation, a misguided attempt to restore the sacred in a world that no longer speaks its language. When the soul is wounded, it does not bleed outward, it bleeds inward, blindly seeking anesthesia in any form it can grasp. Thus, addiction is not merely a habit or vice, it is a symbolic cry for healing, a dark ritual performed in the shadows, a desperate attempt to mend what the psyche can no longer bear. In this light, the addict is not a willful violator, but a seeker of wholeness, clumsy perhaps, but their search for liberation is legitimate. The search for meaning and symbol. As we have seen, the spiral of addiction tightens not because of a weak will, but because of a soul that is desperately searching. Jung saw through this. Addiction is not a moral failing or merely a disease. It is a message, a symptom of the soul's exile. It is a bright, flashing signal from the unconscious, calling the individual to look beneath the surface symptoms and confront the deeper wound. Like every true crisis, it carries within it the seeds of transformation. Through a Jungian lens, addiction is not an accident of biology, nor merely a lapse of willpower. It is a spiritual message, a coded plea from the unconscious, calling for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the person has been exiled, something that longs not to destroy, but to be understood, to be met with empathy. To sympathize with the addict without seeking the symbolic message behind the behavior is to silence the very voice that can lead to healing. Jung never asked us to excuse destructive behaviors, but he taught us to look beneath them. He taught us to ask not, "What's wrong with you?" but "What is your pain trying to say?" Seen through this lens, addiction becomes an archetypal story, not a moral defect, but a wounded inner child seeking a lost parent, a fragmented soul yearning for reunion, a sacred thirst misdirected towards secular substitutes. Behind the self-destruction lies an ancient longing, a forgotten truth buried in the rubble of repression. For Jung, to deny this longing is to deny the humanity of the addict. He reminds us, the wound is where the light enters. The substance or behavior is only the outer symptom. The real work is inside. What the addict pursues externally is often a reflection of what they have been forced to abandon internally. Thus, addiction is not just a trap, it is a compass, distorted perhaps, but not meaningless. It is not about pleasure, but about unmet needs, about unrecognized wholeness. It is a call to spiritual experience, to reconnect with the sacred center of one's being. To answer this call, one must go down, not into shame, but into deep inquiry. The question is no longer, why are you addicted? But what are you really seeking beneath this pain? When a person repeatedly seeks relief they do not understand, when they feel driven by an inner force beyond their consent, they are confronting the face of the shadow. The shadow, as Jung taught, is not evil. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It holds our primal emotions, unmet needs, and ancient wounds, exiled not because they are wicked, but because they threaten our adaptation, our self-image, our very survival. Yet what is buried in the unconscious never truly disappears. It transforms, and when not consciously welcomed, it demands expression elsewhere, in compulsion, in craving, in collapse. Yet paradoxically, within that collapse lies the doorway to awakening. For if the shadow is met with courage and compassion, it no longer sabotages but begins to serve. One of its most common disguises is addiction, a symptom not of moral failure, but of deep psychological fragmentation. This is Jung's essential insight. Addiction is not merely a habit, but a symbol. In the language of the soul, every symptom is a messenger. The psyche, when wounded, does not scream with logic. It whispers with symbols, behaviors, and seemingly irrational repetitions that carry profound inner meaning. Addiction is a messenger, from Jung's perspective. Addiction is not a pathology to be eradicated. Rather, it is a message, a symptom of the soul's exile. It is a bright, flashing signal from the unconscious, calling the individual to descend, to look beneath the surface symptoms, and to face the deeper wound. Like every true crisis, it contains the seeds of transformation. Addiction is not an accident of biology, nor simply a lapse of willpower. It is a spiritual message, a coded plea from the unconscious, calling for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the person has been banished, something that longs not to destroy, but to be un. In the language of the soul, every symptom is a messenger. When the psyche is wounded, it does not shout through logic. It whispers through symbols, behaviors, and seemingly irrational, the addictive substance, the repeated behavior. These are only outward symptoms. The real work lies within. What the addict seeks externally is often a reflection of what they were forced to abandon. In turn, Jung never asked us to excuse destructive behaviors, but he taught us to look beneath them. He taught us to ask not, what's wrong with you? But monadim, what here is Jung's essential insight? Addiction is not merely a habit, it is a symbol, a symbolic cry for healing, an unconscious ritual enacted in the dark, a desperate attempt to mend what the mind can no longer bear. What the addict seeks in the addictive substance is not the substance itself, but what it represents: wholeness, comfort, strength, forgiveness, belonging. Seen this way, we no longer see the addict as a faulty human, but as a person on an archetypal path. A path not of, when one begins this inner journey, addiction ceases to be a curse and starts to be recognized as a symbol, a messenger carrying urgent news from the depths of the soul. Something inside needs attention. Something crave. No matter how terrifying, the addict's suffering reveals a surprising truth that within them still stirs a longing for the eternal, a yearning for something real, even if it is buried beneath guilt and comfort. From a Jungian perspective, recovery is not about fixing a mechanical problem. It is about guiding the individual back to their inner center, back to the vital flame buried beneath years of fear, denial, and despair. The scar is no longer a sign of weakness, but a landmark. Addiction, once seen as a sentence, becomes a call to a deeper life. As mentioned, through Jung's lens, addiction is not simply a mistake or failure. It is a spiritual message, a coded plea from the unconscious. It reveals that something essential within the individual has been banished. This brings us to the concept of the shadow. According to Jung, the shadow is not evil. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It is what has been forgotten, unwanted, and deemed unacceptable. The shadow contains our primal emotions, unmet needs, and ancient wounds. These are not exiled because they are wicked, but because they threaten our adaptation, our self-image, and our survival. Yet what is buried in the unconscious never truly disappears. It transforms, and when it is not consciously welcomed, it demands expression elsewhere, in compulsions, cravings, and collapse. What is repressed does not fade into oblivion. It returns with even greater force, demanding to be acknowledged. It leaks into our actions in moments of weakness, in self-destructive choices, in behaviors that even the person engaging in them can't understand. This is where the shadow is so closely intertwined with addiction. One of its most common disguises is addiction itself, a symptom not of moral failure, but of profound psychological fragmentation. At the center of every addictive pattern is an inner battle. On one side is the persona, the external mask, always striving to be in control, to succeed, to be accepted, and to maintain the illusion of wholeness. On the other is the hidden self, the wounded landscape of the psyche, carrying unspoken pain, repressed anger, and long-forgotten grief. Instead of confronting this buried pain, the addict tries to suppress it, to numb it. But as Jung taught, the shadow cannot be banished without consequence. What is repressed will return with even greater force. The real conflict is internal, a silent struggle between the part of oneself that wants to express pain and the part that fears, judges, and locks it away. This internal friction creates deep psychological tension, an anxiety that cannot be traced, gnawing at the soul and eroding any sense of peace. Even when the addictive substance is removed, the emptiness often remains. Irritability, depression, and confusion persist not because the chemical dependency is still there, but because the real wound, the internal fragmentation, has not been touched. The substance, the habit, the behavior, these were never the root. They were the symptoms, a veil over the deeper cry. The shadow shifts forms, from alcohol to overworking, from sex to overeating, and so on. But the pattern repeats because the internal split has not healed. In this light, addiction is not merely a biological accident or a lapse of willpower. It is a psychological message, a coded plea from the unconscious, calling for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the individual has been exiled, not something that seeks to destroy, but something that longs to be understood. Jung emphasized that the emptiness many addicts feel is not a lack of the substance, but a fragmentation of the psyche itself. The addict does not truly crave a drug. They crave a reunion with love, with safety, with their own soul. What they truly seek in the addictive substance is not the substance itself, but what it symbolizes: wholeness, comfort, strength, forgiveness, belonging. When the soul is wounded, it does not bleed outward. It bleeds inward, blindly searching for any form of anesthesia it can grasp. The repetition of addictive behaviors becomes an unconscious ritual, a prayer for numbness instead of memory. The Jungian path of healing is not about fixing a malfunction. It is an archetypal journey, a call to return to the inner center. The addict's suffering, no matter how horrific, reveals something astonishing. Within them still stirs a sacred longing, a thirst for truth, for unity, for inner reconciliation. Addiction is the broken language of a soul crying out to be seen. When that cry is met with sincere attention, with a listening that does not judge or attempt to fix but simply witnesses, the compulsion to escape begins to dissolve. Wholeness does not demand perfection. It demands truth, the courage to face oneself not with violence but with compassion. Healing the addict is not about forgetting or erasing. It is about remembering that even in the darkest hour, a seed of light has been buried within. Inner conflict and spiritual fragmentation. As we have seen in the earlier sections, the shadow holds the parts of ourselves that have been rejected and forgotten by the psyche. When these parts are exiled, they do not disappear but become more powerful, creating a deep psychological fragmentation. This is the core of the inner conflict the addict faces. According to Jung, addiction is not just a bad habit or a failure of will. It is an expression of a soul in exile, a brilliant signal from the unconscious urging the individual to descend, to look deeper beneath the surface symptoms, and to confront the deeper wound. This wound is the fragmentation of the soul. At the center of every addictive pattern is an internal battle. On one side is the persona, the outward-facing mask, struggling to control, succeed, be accepted, and maintain the illusion of wholeness. On the other is the hidden self, the wounded land of the psyche, harboring unspoken pain, repressed anger, and long-forgotten sorrow. Instead of confronting this buried pain, the addict tries to suppress and numb it in order to keep the shadow at bay. But the shadow cannot be banished without consequences. What is repressed returns with even greater force. The real conflict is internal, a silent struggle between the part of oneself that longs to express pain and the part that fears, judges, and locks it away. This inner friction creates deep psychological tension, a gnawing anxiety that cannot be traced, that eats away at the soul and erodes one's sense of peace. Even when the addictive substance is removed, the emptiness often remains. Irritability, depression, and confusion persist, not because the chemical dependence is still there, but because the real wound, the inner fragmentation, has not been touched. The substance, the habit, the behavior, these were never the root. They were the symptom, a veil covering the deeper cry from a fragmented soul. The shadow changes forms, from alcohol to overwork, from sex to overeating. But the pattern repeats itself because the internal split has not healed. In this light, addiction is not a random biological accident or simply a failure of will. It is a psychological message, a coded plea from the unconscious, calling for balance, integration, and wholeness. It reveals that something essential within the individual has been exiled, not something that seeks to destroy, but something that longs to be understood. Jung emphasized that the emptiness many addicts feel is not about the lack of the substance, but about the fragmentation of the psyche itself. The addict does not really crave the drug. They long for reunion with love, safety, and their own soul. What they truly seek in the addictive substance is not the substance itself, but what it symbolizes: wholeness, comfort, strength, forgiveness, belonging. When the soul is wounded, it does not bleed outward, it bleeds inward, blindly seeking any form of anesthesia it can grasp. The repetition of addictive behavior becomes an unconscious ritual, a prayer for numbness instead of memory. The Jungian path of healing is not about fixing a mechanical error. It is an archetypal journey, a call to return to the inner center. The addict's suffering, no matter how terrible, reveals something astonishing. Within them still stirs a sacred yearning, a thirst for truth, for unity, for inner reconciliation. Addiction is the broken language of a soul crying out to be seen. When that cry is met with sincere attention, with listening that does not judge or attempt to fix but simply witnesses, the compulsion to escape begins to dissolve. Wholeness does not demand perfection. It demands truth, the courage to face oneself, not with violence, but with compassion. Healing the addict is not about forgetting or erasing. It is about remembering that even in the darkest hour, a seed of light has been buried within. As we have discussed, addiction is an expression of deep psychological fragmentation, a battle between the persona, the outward mask, and the exiled shadow. The shadow holds those parts of the self that have been rejected and forgotten. When repressed and not consciously welcomed, the shadow does not disappear, but demands to be expressed elsewhere, often through compulsion, craving, and collapse. Addiction is one of the most common masks worn by the shadow. According to Jung, the path to wholeness and overcoming addiction does not lie in fighting or erasing the shadow or the addictive behaviors. Rather, it is a process of shadow integration. What is shadow integration? It is the courageous act of bringing the unconscious, forgotten, feared, or despised parts of the self into the light of consciousness. It is not about blaming the outside world or justifying harmful behaviors. Instead, it is about looking deeply into the inner mirror without distortion. It is about recognizing that the shadow is not evil. It is everything we refuse to see in ourselves. It contains our raw emotions, unmet needs, and old wounds. Why is shadow integration essential for healing addiction? Addiction is a symptom of profound psychological division. As long as this internal split remains unhealed, the addictive pattern repeats itself. The shadow may change forms, but the deeper cry from the fragmented soul remains unaddressed. When the shadow is ignored, it rules from the darkness, making the individual its hostage. Integration brings the shadow into consciousness, transforming the individual from its hostage into its student. Confronting the shadow is a spiritual initiation. It requires a courageous descent into the psychological underworld, not to remain trapped there, but to dialogue with it and ask, "What have you come to teach me?" The shadow is not just darkness, it is potential wrapped in pain. Hidden beneath the rubble of rejection and repression are lost capacities, raw feelings, instinctive wisdom, sacred anger, and buried creativity. Integrating the shadow is the art of rescuing these exiled parts of oneself, not to be dominated by them, but to welcome them into conscious wholeness. The process of confrontation and integration. It requires courage and radical honesty. When one begins this inner journey, they stop seeing addiction as a curse and start recognizing it as a symbol, a messenger carrying urgent news from the depths of the soul. Something inside needs attention. Something yearns to be understood, not suppressed. Real transformation is not achieved by fighting symptoms, but by illuminating their source. In this inward turning, something profound happens. The compulsion begins to loosen its grip. The behavior that once held such power loses its sacred status as the sole source of relief. Instead, a more honest, intimate relationship with the self begins to emerge. Destructive impulses no longer issue commands, they become signals, and when they are heard, the healing begins. As one faces the shadow, the addict begins to see themselves not as broken, but as divided. In that realization, shame softens into understanding. What once was seen as weakness now becomes a map. The scar becomes a landmark. Addiction ceases to be a sentence and becomes a call to a deeper life. This path is not linear. It is winding, stumbling, repeating. But through presence and compassion, everything changes. One begins to feel not just the pain, but the meaning of the pain. They begin to decode the language of their suffering. The outcome of shadow integration. From this inner alchemy emerges a self that is more deeply rooted, more conscious, and stronger. Suffering is no longer seen as punishment. It becomes initiation. The shadow is no longer a terrifying enemy, but emerges as a guide. Life no longer revolves around avoidance, but around awareness. Wholeness does not require perfection. It requires truth. The courage to face oneself, not with violence, but with compassion. Healing is not about forgetting or erasing, but about remembering that even in the darkest hour, a seed of light was buried within. Wounds as portals and potential. As analyzed in previous sections, addiction is not merely a bad habit or a weakness of will. It is the expression of a deep psychological wound. It is the symbolic cry of an exiled soul, a profound psychological fragmentation. The shadow holds these rejected parts of the self, including old wounds and unmet needs. When these wounds are left unacknowledged, they build up psychological tension and manifest through addictive behaviors as an unconscious attempt, often desperate, to soothe or numb the pain. However, from Jung's perspective, the wound is not only the source of suffering, it is also a doorway to profound transformation and potential. Why is the wound a portal and potential, according to Jung? The wound is the messenger of the soul. Addiction, as the expression of a psychological wound, is not a moral failure or an accident. It is a message from the soul, a coded call from the unconscious. The soul, when wounded, does not scream with logic. It whispers through symbols, repeated behaviors that seem irrational but carry deep inner meaning. This wound is trying to say something. The wound is where the light enters. One of Jung's most famous quotes is, "The wound is where the light enters." This perspective flips the conventional view of the wound as a weakness to be hidden or removed. Instead, the wound itself becomes the opening, the vulnerable place that allows truth, insight, and ultimately light, healing, wholeness to enter the soul. Potential is hidden in pain. The shadow, which houses the unhealed wounds and rejected parts, is not just darkness. It is potential wrapped in pain. Jung called this the gold in the dark. Beneath the rubble of rejection and repression lies lost capacities, raw feelings, instinctive wisdom, sacred anger, and buried creativity. Suffering as initiation. Jung saw the deep suffering of the addict not merely as punishment or a mechanical disease to be cured. Rather, it is often an initiation, a spiritual journey, a courageous descent into the psychological underworld of the self. Like the ancient initiation rites, this descent often involves a symbolic death, the death of the false identity clung to for survival, and a rebirth into a more whole and integrated self. The wound and the suffering are the catalysts, the gateway to this journey. The wound reveals a deep longing. The pain, no matter how intense, reveals a surprising truth. Within it still burns a longing for eternity, a hunger for something real. Beneath the guilt and confusion, that longing is the ember of transformation. Pain drives a person to hit bottom, not only outwardly but inwardly, where the old ego breaks apart and the deeper self begins to awaken. Healing is transforming the wound. True healing is not about forgetting or erasing the wound. It is about remembering and transforming it. When the seed of light, always present even in the darkest hour, begins to take root in the psyche, it not only changes what a person does, but transforms how they see themselves. They no longer identify with the wound as if it defines them completely. Instead, they begin to see themselves through a more transcendent lens, as a being capable of transforming the wound, not just surviving it. Facing the wound. Acknowledging and confronting the wound requires courage and radical honesty. It means giving up avoidance and instead choosing to be present with the pain. Not running, but feeling. True transformation happens in the stillness, in the unseen moment when the soul chooses to feel the pain instead of fleeing from it. Decoding the language of suffering. When facing the wound with compassion, a person begins to decipher the language of their suffering. The pain no longer feels meaningless, but reveals its meaning, asking, "What have you come to teach me?" Instead of seeing the pain as the enemy, one can begin a dialogue with it and ask, "What have you come to teach me?" Integrating the shadow. The process of integrating the shadow, where the wounds are stored, is the art of rescuing these parts, not to be ruled by them, but to welcome them into conscious wholeness. The result. When the wound is faced and integrated, it is no longer a sentence or a sign of weakness. Pain becomes meaning. Suffering is no longer seen as punishment, it becomes initiation. The scar becomes a signpost. What was once seen as weakness now becomes a map. The scar becomes a signpost. Addiction ceases to be a sentence and becomes a call to a deeper life. Suffering becomes a teacher, suffering becomes a sacred teacher, and pain becomes a portal. From fragmentation to wholeness. From this inner alchemy emerges a self that is more deeply rooted, more conscious, and stronger. In summary, according to Jung, psychological wounds in addiction are not the end, but the beginning. By courageously facing and integrating the wounded parts of the self, through shadow integration, one can transform pain into meaning, the wound into a gateway to profound transformation, releasing the potential hidden in the dark, and ultimately achieving inner wholeness. The addict, through the very wound they carry, holds the seed of deep transformation, if they are brave enough to listen. Spiritual experience in the encounter with the symbol. Jung regarded addiction not merely as a bad habit or a lack of willpower, but as a deep cry of a wounded soul, a desperate, often unconscious effort to heal the inner fragmentation, a severing from the center of one's being. The pain the addict feels is existential, and so is the longing. They long for something real, a connection with something greater, a union with the sacred center of their being. They do not truly crave the addictive substance itself, but rather what it represents: wholeness, comfort, power, forgiveness, belonging. Jung believed that for a soul deeply wounded and fragmented, as in the case of the addict, the true antidote lies not in logic or sheer willpower, but in something much deeper. The Jungian focus. Spiritual experience as the antidote. Addiction is a distorted spiritual hunger. From Jung's perspective, addiction is a spiritual hunger, a sacred longing, a fierce, albeit misguided, thirst for spiritual transcendence. It is a desperate attempt to dissolve the ego, to escape the unbearable burden of fragmentation, and to taste, even for a moment, a sense of unity. However, when this longing is directed at substances or compulsive behaviors, the soul's hunger only deepens. The true solution is a spiritual experience. Jung famously wrote, "Spirit alone can cure spirit." He believed that the only true remedy for addiction is a spiritual awakening, a profound inner transformation that reshapes the psychological landscape. It is not rules or discipline, but the emergence of meaning, an innate need for the sacred. Jung observed in his clinical practice that those who cannot establish a symbolic relationship with the sacred remain trapped in the cycle of suffering. This suggests that the need to connect with something greater is not a luxury, but an essential feature of the human psyche. When these inner symbols decay, when myths die and are not replaced, the soul begins to fragment and addiction appears. Meaning is the transformative factor. For Jung, meaning is not a mere philosophical concept, but a powerful force that can awaken the soul. Meaning emerges most vividly when a person reaches rock bottom, not just externally, but internally, when the old ego collapses and the deeper self begins to awaken. It is this emergence of meaning that can combat the spirit of compulsion. Inner experience, not intellectual explanation. Jung found that those burdened by deep suffering do not need intellectual explanations. Rather, they need an inner experience, a symbolic encounter that touches the soul, strong enough to reorder the inner chaos and breathe new life into the broken center. It is an encounter with the sacred, a moment of inner revelation that can reconnect the fragmented story of existence. the central role of the symbol, and the encounter with the symbol. Symbols are the language of the soul. The psyche, when wounded, does not shout through logic. It whispers through symbols, through repeated behaviors that seem irrational but carry deep inner meaning. Addiction is a psychological message, a coded plea from the unconscious. It is a symbol in the language of the soul, the symbol as the new psychological axis mundi. For transformation to occur, the psyche must encounter a symbol strong enough to function as a new central axis, a guiding image, a dream, a vision, something that speaks not to the intellect, but to the soul. The origin of the symbol. This symbol cannot be imposed from the outside. It arises from the inner world, often only after the individual has humbly faced the darkness and chosen not to flee. It is in the stillness, in that invisible moment, when the soul chooses to feel instead of run, that true transformation occurs. The symbol is a doorway to a deeper reality. A symbol is not merely an intellectual accessory. It is a doorway to a deeper reality where self-understanding becomes reconciliation with the past, with pain, and ultimately with the sacred potential for freedom. The symbol transforms pain. When the symbol takes root in the soul, life no longer revolves around avoidance, but around awareness. What once was unbearable becomes bearable, not because it is less painful, but because it now carries meaning. And where there is meaning, there is strength. The inner encounter is a sacred initiation. Jung emphasized that facing the shadow, which contains our wounds and rejected parts, is not merely a clinical matter. It is a sacred initiation. It is kneeling before the unlit altar of the soul and saying, I am ready to see what I once could not. True healing cannot be imposed from the outside. It must arise from a courageous inner descent. In summary, from Jung's perspective, addiction arises from a deep spiritual hunger and the fragmentation of the soul when it loses connection with the sacred and the inner symbols. True healing is not achieved by fighting the symptom, but by facing its root through a profound spiritual experience. An archetypal encounter with a healing symbol that reestablishes meaning and reconnects the individual with their sacred center. The wound, the pain, and the descent into darkness all serve as the doorway in the preparation for the soul to receive this healing symbol and begin a profound transformation. Rebirth and transfiguration, the outcome of the descent. From crisis to transfiguration. For Jung, a deep crisis, like the struggle with addiction, carries within it the seed of metamorphosis. It is not merely a pathological issue to be eliminated, but a message from the soul, a brilliant signal from the unconscious calling the individual to descend, to look beneath the symptoms and to face the deeper wound. This descent holds the sacred potential to reclaim what was lost and to awaken a forgotten self. Not merely recovery, but rebirth. Jung did not speak of curing the addict in a sterile sense of repairing a malfunction. He spoke of guiding them back to their inner center, to the living flame buried beneath years of fear, denial, and despair. This requires a rebirth, a surrender of the false identity the individual clings to for survival, and a rebirth into a more whole self. Surrender, not willpower. The key is that this rebirth is not achieved through strong willpower. Instead, it comes through surrender. Not surrender to weakness, but surrender to the inner process, to the quiet wisdom of the soul. In that surrender, the symbol begins to speak. Meaning as the transformative factor. Jung saw that meaning emerges most vividly when a person reaches rock bottom, not just externally but internally, when the old ego breaks apart and the deeper self begins to stir. In that surrender, what was once unbearable becomes bearable, not because it hurts less, but because it now carries meaning. And where there is meaning, there is strength. The symbol as the doorway. A healing symbol cannot be imposed from the outside. It arises from the inner world, often only after the individual has humbly faced the darkness and chosen not to flee. It is in that stillness, in that invisible moment when the soul chooses to feel instead of run, that true transformation occurs. The symbol is not just an intellectual accessory, it is the doorway to a deeper reality, a shift in perspective. When the healing symbol takes root in the soul, life no longer revolves around avoidance, but around awareness. The individual no longer identifies with the wound as if it defines them completely. Instead, they begin to see themselves through a more transcendent lens, as a being capable not just of surviving, but of transforming the wound. Pain becomes a guide. Pain is no longer seen as punishment, it becomes initiation. The path is not linear, it winds, stumbles, and repeats. But through presence and compassion, something changes. One begins to feel not just the pain, but the meaning of the pain. They begin to decode the language of their suffering. The shadow becomes a guide. Integrating the shadow requires courage and radical honesty. When the shadow is brought into consciousness, it no longer rules from the darkness. The individual is no longer its prisoner, but its student. The shadow ceases to be a terrifying enemy and instead becomes a guide. Truth and wholeness. Healing is not about forgetting or erasing, but about remembering that even in the darkest hour, a seed of light has been planted. Wholeness does not demand perfection, it demands truth, the courage to face oneself not with violence, but with compassion. A new life is born. From this inner alchemy emerges a self that is more deeply rooted, more conscious, and stronger. Healing from the Jungian perspective is not about returning to an earlier state, but about a birth. Something previously unknown emerges from the depths, a form of life that can only grow through the furnace of the abyss. A deeper connection. The encounter with the symbol is the doorway to a deeper reality. A world where self-understanding becomes reconciliation with the past, with pain, and ultimately with the sacred potential for freedom. This is the path of reconciliation with the mystery of human existence. The real journey begins not when the pain ends, but when the pain is no longer feared. True freedom arises when the stillness beneath the suffering becomes the place from which it can emerge. In summary, from Jung's perspective, the path out of addiction culminates in a profound process of rebirth and transfiguration. It is not a battle of willpower, but a surrender to the inner process. Through a courageous confrontation with the shadow and an encounter with the healing symbol that emerges from the unconscious, the individual undergoes a sacred initiation. Suffering is not removed but transformed into meaning, becoming a guide. The result is a rebirth into a more whole, meaningful, and sacred existence. A life rooted in truth and awareness rather than avoidance. This is the birth of something new, a transfiguration that can only happen when one passes through the abyss,